I never imagined that my life would be turned upside down in the way it did. People talk about life-changing moments, about the kind of events that define who you are, and they often tell you that you'll see it coming. That was never the case for me. It all started with the phone call that no one should ever have to receive. I was sitting at my desk, in the quiet of my apartment, when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Lauren, my fiancée. It wasn't unusual for us to exchange a few messages throughout the day. But this one stood out. It wasn't a good morning or a quick check-in. It was a single line, "We need to talk." I felt a strange, cold knot tighten in my stomach, a feeling of dread that had no immediate explanation. I called her immediately. "Hey, what's going on? You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But she didn't answer right away, which only made my anxiety spike higher. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Of course. What is it?" I pressed, heart pounding in my chest. And then she said it. "I'm pregnant, and it's not yours." My world crashed. I remember my vision blurred as I tried to make sense of what she had just said. My fiancée, pregnant, but by my brother. It didn't make sense. She went on, explaining how it happened, how it was a mistake, how she never meant for things to get so complicated. But no matter what she said, it didn't matter. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the screen, unable to process the words she had spoken. I felt like I had been hit by a freight train, the weight of betrayal heavier than anything I had ever imagined. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for what felt like hours, wondering how the hell I had ended up here. My mind raced. How could she do this? How could my brother do this? And my mother, what was she going to say? The worst part wasn't just the betrayal, though that was bad enough. No, the worst part came when I finally confronted my mother. We were close as any mother and son could be. I had always gone to her for advice, comfort, or just to vent about life. But when I called her to tell her the news, I didn't know what I was expecting. Perhaps some support, maybe a listening ear. Instead, she seemed happy. "John, this is wonderful," she exclaimed when I told her the shocking truth. "You're going to be an uncle. This is a new chapter for our family. Just think about it." I stared at the phone in disbelief. I had just shared the worst news of my life, and all she could think about was how wonderful it was. I couldn't understand. My fiancée was pregnant by my brother, and my mother was acting like it was the best thing that ever happened to us. She didn't even seem to care about my feelings, my hurt, my anger. "I don't think you understand, Mom," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "This is a disaster. This isn't just about having a baby, it's about trust, and loyalty, and everything falling apart. It's my fiancé, Mom, my fiancé. I know, but think of the baby. It's a miracle. This is a good thing. And you'll all work it out." She spoke as if it were as simple as finding a solution to a puzzle. As if the fact that my fiancé had betrayed me in the worst possible way didn't matter. I ended the call, feeling completely alone. The people I trusted the most had failed me, and the reality of what had happened hit me like a tidal wave. The next few months were a blur. Lauren and my brother, Matt, moved in together. She had the baby, a boy named Ethan, who grew up to be a curious little toddler with big eyes and a smile that could light up any room. My mother was right about one thing: there was a sense of joy in the air every time Ethan was around. And it was clear that despite everything that had happened, my family was embracing the new reality. I tried my best to move on. I focused on work, on avoiding Matt, on putting my feelings aside and dealing with the situation. There were days when I wanted to scream, days when I wanted to confront Lauren, days when I wanted to tear everything down and start over. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. I put on a mask. I pretended everything was fine, even though inside, I was falling apart. Over time, I became numb. I saw Lauren and Matt together, raising Ethan, and I watched as my mother fawned over the child like he was the greatest gift to our family. Ethan was loved by all, and I couldn't help but feel resentful. How could they be so happy? How could they act like nothing had happened? But life went on. The years passed. Ethan got older. He grew attached to me. I became his uncle, the one who would take him to the park, play catch, and teach him how to ride a bike. It was strange, feeling this deep affection for a child that wasn't even mine. But that was the way things had evolved. I couldn't deny that I loved him, that I cared for him. But it didn't erase the pain. 5 years had passed since that day. My life had settled into a strange kind of rhythm. I had distanced myself from Lauren and Matt, kept my interactions with them minimal, and focused on my own life. But there was always that weight, the feeling that something was wrong, something that couldn't be fixed. Then, one evening, I got another phone call. This time, it was from my mother. "John," she said, her voice trembling, "I need you to do something for me." I wasn't sure what to expect. My mind immediately went to Ethan. Maybe something had happened to him. Or something was wrong with Lauren or Matt. But what she said next made my stomach drop. "I need you to come over. It's about your father," she began. "He's sick. He's been in the hospital for a while. And I don't know what to do. I need you here." I froze, my heart racing. My father had always been a difficult man. Emotionally distant, never really involved in my life. But now, he was in the hospital. And my mother needed me. It was strange, how life could turn on a dime. Here I was, still holding on to the pain of years past. And yet, my mother needed me. When I arrived at her house, it was clear that things had changed. My mother's hair was graying, her face etched with age. She was no longer the vibrant, strong woman I had once known. And there, sitting in the corner of the room, was Matt. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. I could feel the tension in the air. But it wasn't about Matt. It wasn't about the betrayal. It was about my father, who lay in the hospital bed, pale and weak. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew that despite everything that had happened, this moment was important. I stayed, not for Matt, not for Lauren, but for my mother, for my family. The following weeks were filled with hospital visits, uncomfortable silences, and attempts to repair a broken relationship. My father passed away, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind a legacy of regret and unspoken words. But in the end, something unexpected happened. During those final days, I found myself sitting by his bedside, talking to him as if we were old friends. And in that moment, I realized that life wasn't just about the pain or the betrayals we endured. It was about how we chose to move forward, how we chose to love despite everything. When my father died, I didn't feel relief or joy, but I felt a sense of closure. I understood that sometimes, the past could never be fully fixed. But the future was ours to shape. A year later, I was at peace. My relationship with Matt had improved. We had reconciled, not because everything was forgiven, but because we understood each other now. And Ethan had grown into a boy who loved his uncle. And I loved him back, even if he was the product of my brother's mistake. Then one day, my mother called again. This time, her voice wasn't trembling. "I'm proud of you, John," she said. "You've come so far. We've all come so far." And I realized then that sometimes, life doesn't give you the happy ending you think you want. But it does give you what you need. It gives you the chance to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. And in the end, that's all anyone can hope for. As the years passed, I found myself growing more accustomed to the delicate balance that life had handed me. It wasn't easy, but I had become adept at navigating the complexities of family dynamics, of moving forward while carrying the weight of past betrayals. But no matter how much I tried to bury the hurt, there were moments, quiet moments that would bring it all rushing back. It was a Saturday morning, a rare moment when I wasn't distracted by work or obligations. I was sitting on the couch, sipping my coffee and flipping through a book I had meant to read for ages. When I saw the notification on my phone, my mother had left a voicemail. I hesitated. It had been a while since I'd heard from her. And while things had settled, there was always that nagging unease that came whenever she reached out unexpectedly. Maybe it was my lingering trust issues. Maybe it was just the years of history between us. I played the message. "John, it's Mom. I need to talk to you. Can you come by?" That was all. No context, no urgency in her voice. But I could sense there's something different. I put the phone down and stared at the empty space in front of me, trying to ignore the wave of tension building in my chest. After a few moments, I stood up, grabbed my keys, and left. When I arrived at my mother's house, the place felt different. The air was heavy with the unspoken. It wasn't like the home I remembered growing up, the one that had been full of laughter, arguments, and the chaotic warmth of family. Now, it felt like a place where the walls themselves had absorbed too much history, too much pain. She was in the kitchen, standing by the counter, stirring a pot of soup. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't place, something hesitant, unsure. "Hi, honey, I made your favorite." She gestured to the soup, but it felt like an afterthought. "I'm glad you could come over." I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure, what's up? You said you needed to talk." She nodded, her fingers lingering on the edge of the ladle as if gathering the courage to speak. The silence stretched on longer than I was comfortable with. Finally, she set the ladle down and turned to face me. "John, I need to apologize," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. For everything. For what happened with Lauren and Matt. For the way I handled it all. I was so focused on the baby, on keeping the family together in my own way, that I lost sight of what mattered most. I hurt you. Her words, so simple, yet so heavy, hung in the air. For a moment, I was speechless. My mother, the woman who had always been so strong, so certain, was now asking for my forgiveness. Not just for her part in the betrayal, but for the way she had reacted. The way she had dismissed my feelings and put her own desires above mine. I could feel the walls I'd built around myself begin to crack. But even then, I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive. I wasn't sure I even knew how. I'm not sure you can make up for what happened, I said quietly, my voice steady but distant. It's not just about the past. It's about everything that came after. About how we all pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. I know, I was wrong. I should have been there for you. Instead, I pushed you away. The truth of her words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had blamed her for the way things had played out. For the way she had sided with Matt and Lauren in the aftermath of everything. But sitting here now, in the quiet of her kitchen, I realized that she had her own wounds to carry. She had her own struggles with what had happened. And perhaps, like me, she didn't know how to deal with it all. The weeks that followed were strange. I continued to visit my mother, not because I felt like I had to, but because I started to see her in a different light. The mother I had known wasn't perfect, but she was doing her best. And maybe that was all any of us could do. I spent more time with Ethan, who was growing into a bright, energetic little boy. Every time I looked at him, I saw a glimpse of the future, one that was still uncertain. Still fragile, but filled with possibility. Maybe he wasn't my son by blood, but the bond we had formed over the years was real. I loved him, and I knew he loved me. Matt and I had started to talk again. We were never going to be the same. Never going to return to what we had been before everything fell apart. But there was a fragile peace between us. I didn't have to like what had happened, but I could accept that life was too short to carry around all that anger. Still, there was something gnawing at me, something that kept me from fully moving on. It wasn't until one day, when I was visiting my mother, that I understood what it was. I had just arrived, and she was sitting on the porch, watching Ethan play in the yard. There was a calm in the air, a warmth that felt like healing, but I could still see the tension in my mother's face. John, she said, her voice low, as I sat down beside her, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how I kept things from you. About how I tried to fix everything in my own way. And there's something I need to tell you. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What is it? Her gaze dropped to the ground. And for a moment, I thought she wouldn't continue. But then, she took a deep breath and looked at me again. It's about Matt, she said softly. There's something I didn't tell you. Something I didn't want to burden you with. But I think it's time you know. I braced myself. My heart began to race. Unsure of what she was going to say. Had she known all along? Was there more to the story? I don't know how to explain it. She continued, her voice thick with emotion. But Matt, he was hurting too. He didn't know how to deal with everything either. I don't think he ever intended for things to go the way they did. He made a terrible mistake. Yes, but it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about his own pain. He never knew how to ask for help. And I didn't know how to help him either. I sat there, stunned. I had never considered that Matt might have been suffering in his own way. The years of resentment, of anger and betrayal, had clouded my judgment. I had seen him as the enemy, as the person who had destroyed everything. But in that moment, I saw him differently, not as the person who had stolen my fiancée, but as someone who had been lost. Just like me, the days turned into months, and I started to feel a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't easy. The scars of the past would never fully disappear, but they began to fade. I realized that I didn't have to carry the past with me forever. I didn't have to let it define me. One evening, after spending time with Ethan, I went to visit Lauren. We hadn't spoken much since everything had happened. But I needed closure. I needed to tell her how I felt, how everything had shattered. How I had struggled to forgive. And I needed to know that, despite everything, we could both move forward. When I walked into her apartment, she was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. She turned when she heard the door open. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was so much history between us. So many things left unsaid. Finally, I broke the silence. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what happened, I said, my voice steady but tired. But I want you to know, for Ethan's sake, that I'm trying. I want him to know that there's more to life than just hurt and anger. I want him to see that we can still be a family. In some way. Lauren nodded, tears in her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly, but thank you for trying. And with that, for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the happy ending I had imagined, but it was the one I needed. Sometimes, life doesn't give us the answers we want, but it gives us the chance to choose how we move forward. And in the end, that was enough. The weight of the past still lingered, but in a way that wasn't suffocating anymore. It was more like a scar, something that had healed but left a mark. I started to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the hurt, to acknowledge it and accept it as part of who I was, but not let it dictate who I would become. The months after that conversation with Lauren passed quietly. Ethan continued to grow, to thrive in a world that was still tangled up in complications. I saw him often, picking him up from school, taking him to the park, teaching him how to play chess and throw a football. My role in his life had become more defined, even if it wasn't the one I had ever expected to have. But in the end, it didn't matter how he had come into the world. What mattered was that I was there for him now. And he was a part of my world. Matt, on the other hand, was still a tricky part of my life. We would exchange the occasional text or have a drink together on rare occasions. But it was always tense. Neither of us ever really spoke about the past in any real way. But we didn't have to. The distance between us had become a kind of peace, one that felt fragile but necessary. The years had changed us both, made us more cautious, more aware of the space we took up in each other's lives. But my mother, she was different. She had become a constant in my life, and for the first time in years, I found myself relying on her again. It wasn't about the past anymore, it was about finding our new way forward. Building a relationship that wasn't defined by what had gone wrong, but by what we could still share. It was a quiet afternoon when the phone rang. I wasn't expecting anything, just going about my usual routine. I answered it without looking at the caller ID, thinking it was just another spam call. John, my mother's voice came through. Urgent, almost frantic. I need you. I didn't even hesitate. Her tone was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a mix of fear and anxiety that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. Mom, what's wrong? I asked, my voice tight with concern. It's your brother, she said, her voice cracking. He's been in an accident. He's at the hospital. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been close to Matt, but hearing that something had happened to him, something serious, shook me. I felt the remnants of my old anger, my old resentment, well up inside me, but it wasn't anger I felt now. It was a deep, sinking fear. Where is he? What happened? I demanded, suddenly in motion, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. I don't know all the details yet. They're saying it's bad. John, I need you to come. Please. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I simply told her I was on my way and hung up the phone. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and sterile hallways. When I arrived, my mother was already there, pacing in the waiting room. She looked older in that moment, her eyes red from crying, her hands wringing together in a nervous gesture that I had seen countless times growing up. Mom, I said, walking toward her, trying to stay calm. Where is he? What's going on? She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something that I wasn't expecting: vulnerability. He's in surgery, John. They're trying to stabilize him. It's bad. I don't know if he'll make it. My heart felt like it stopped beating for a moment. Matt, the brother who had betrayed me, who had torn apart my world, was now lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem possible. How had we gone from years of bitterness and silence to this? I sat down next to my mother, my mind racing. In the past, I would have felt relief, maybe even a sense of justice. But in that moment, I felt nothing but an overwhelming sadness. For Matt, for my mother, for the mess we had made of our lives. The next few hours were agonizing. We sat in the waiting room, not speaking, not knowing what to say. The sterile silence of the hospital seemed to echo the emptiness between my mother and me. It wasn't just Matt on the operating table, it was the years of unspoken words. The broken trust, the lingering resentment, it all hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on us. At some point, the doctor came in. He was a middle-aged man, his face kind but serious. He looked at us, and without any preamble, he said, "Your son is stable for now. The surgery was successful, but there's still a long road ahead. We're not out of the woods yet." My mother let out a breath she had been holding, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt like I could exhale too. He was alive. Matt was alive. We can go see him for a few minutes, the doctor added, giving us a brief nod before turning to leave. I stood up, my legs shaky from the tension that had been building in my chest. My mother's hand gripped my arm, a silent request for support, for comfort, for some kind of reassurance. I gave her what I could, though I didn't feel capable of offering any answers to the turmoil inside both of us. When we entered Matt's room, he was unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily, each one reminding us of how fragile life really was. His face was pale, bruised from the accident, but there was something about him that seemed different. It wasn't just his physical state, it was the vulnerability that showed through. The same vulnerability that I had seen in my mother earlier. I stood at the foot of his bed, unsure of what to say. My brother was in a critical condition. And in that moment, I realized that despite everything that had happened, despite the years of distance and anger, I didn't want him to die. I wanted to yell at him, to demand answers for all the pain he had caused. But instead, I stayed silent. I looked at him, lying there, and all I could think was that this was not how we were supposed to end up. This wasn't the way things were supposed to be. I reached out, placing a hand on the edge of his bed. A small gesture, but one that felt heavy. My mother came up beside me, and we stood there, in the quiet room, just watching him, both of us unsure of what the future held. The man who had torn my life apart, the man who had helped bring Ethan into the world, was still my brother, and for the first time, I understood that we all made mistakes. We all hurt people, but we could also heal. We could choose to move forward, even if it meant doing so in the most unexpected ways. Matt pulled through. His recovery was slow, and there were moments where I wasn't sure he would make it. But eventually, he woke up, and the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry, John." There were no excuses, no justifications, just an apology that carried years of regret. I didn't respond right away. What could I say? The years of anger, of hurt, of resentment were still there, simmering just beneath the surface. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't angry, I wasn't resentful, I was simply tired of carrying all of it. "I know," I said, finally, my voice quiet but steady. "I know, Matt, I've been angry, and I've been hurt, but I'm not going to hold on to it anymore. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. We can start over, if you're ready." And so we did, slowly, cautiously, but we did. It wasn't perfect, but life never was. Ethan continued to grow, and so did we, my family. Fractured and broken, but still standing. There were still scars, of course. But there was also something else now, hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but I had come to understand that sometimes, the hardest journeys lead to the most unexpected destinations. And maybe, just maybe, we would find peace not because everything was fixed, but because we had chosen to heal, one step at a time. And that was enough.